Okay, hello everybody. This is Adrienne. We're just waiting to see, we've just opened up the call and hoping that people can hear me. I see we have about 11 attendees at present, and we'll get started because we only have an hour with you. So, hello, it's Adrienne Montani with First Call, BC Child and Youth Advocacy Coalition. Thank you so much for joining us today as we talk about the this year's 2018 BC Child Poverty Report Card. So what we'll do in the hour we have together is an overview of I want to familiarize you with what's in the report, both its data and its recommendations. So as we run through it, we'll at the end of each section or fact sheet, I can stop and say, ask for clarifying questions about the fact sheet. You can also type them in, and we'll be monitoring those. But if you have larger questions about advocacy, strategy, overall, some bigger questions, maybe you could hold those till the end. We will allow time at the end for that kind of discussion and questions. And maybe, around how's the government responding, if you have questions about that, or which actually we don't have a response from them yet. But so we'll get to those kinds of discussions at the end. But I want to just plow on through the data and make sure that people understand what's in there and how it can be used. So I will be moving quickly through a lot of data, and I do appreciate that some of it may be familiar to you from your own experience, or some of it may be new to you. So first of all, I want to thank why isn't my slide? Okay, there we go. I want to thank, oops, and I didn't change the top. That should say the 22nd Child Poverty Report Card. Thank Spark BC. They are our amazing partner in doing this exercise, this monitoring of child poverty every year in this report. They help with the maps and the number crunching. So huge shout out to Spark BC for their contribution, and also to our national partners who we also, through Campaign 2000, which would be the people in other provinces. This year, 5 other provinces have produced report cards, and there's always a national report card produced by the National Campaign 2000 office as well. So shout out to them, because we work with them on getting the data from Statistics Canada that we use in the report card. And also want to acknowledge the financial support of our supporters. We're hosted administratively, and our charitable work is hosted by the Vancity Community Foundation, and we have office space in a Vancity spot, so we're very happy for that financial support as well. And also to some of our larger union partners, the Health Sciences Association, BC GEU, Teachers Federation, and the Hospital Employees Union, who also have given substantial contributions to First Calls, and we appreciate that. It helps with this work. So I just want to start from looking at, this is a call to action, this report. It's not just a research report. We want it to be a call to action. The evidence in this report illustrates the child poverty crisis that still exists, or certainly existed in 2016. That's when the data is from. And it offers recommendations. We know governments make choices about what they spend and what they collect, what revenue they collect. The choices reflected in the data in this report card are increasing income inequality, and therefore sustaining high levels of poverty. So that's, the choices we make get the outcome that come from those choices. So now I do want to acknowledge that in 2018, both our provincial and federal governments have been paying attention to some of our recommendations, and lots of advocacy through First Call and others around the country and around the province, and they are starting to take steps to address a number of the recommendations that we have in this report card. So as citizens committed to eliminating child poverty, we really need to support governments when they take bold steps, and I'll be referring to some of those later on. So please be engaged. We hope this is a tool for you to use to become engaged with government, to inform your advocacy, and give government permission at senior levels and at local levels to act on our recommendations. So in the report card, as you'll see in this slide, we have in addition to the data, we have some personal stories that illustrate or put a face to the impacts of the issues and the policies that are discussed in the data and the recommendations. There are other illustrations and extra facts that illustrate the issues or the recommendations. We won't have time to go through all of those, so I urge you to go to the report card itself and look through those and get some of that extra information. So please read and use it. We have created a special website. You can see the URL there, www.still1in5.ca. It is linked from the First Call website, or you can go directly to it. Where you'll find the full report, you can jump straight to supporting the recommendations with a letter to the Premier. You can look at the new maps of child poverty rates by various geographical areas. There'll be, you can eventually, we haven't got them posted yet, you'll be able to watch the speeches from the news conference. We had a parent speak and a physician speak, and Scott from Spark introducing the data at the press conference yesterday or 2 days ago. So you'll be able to watch that on the YouTube First Call's YouTube channel. We will be sending out a notice of that in our newsletter and posting it on the site as well. These slides that we're using today and a recording of this webinar will also be posted eventually to Still 1 in 5, along with social media shareables that we'll be uploading shortly. And if you're monitoring social media, you'll know that there are some Twitter postings already that you can retweet and post. So we want to get this information out there far and wide. So please circulate these links to your networks, write to your own MLA, as well as the Premier in support of all of the recommendations or the ones that are most important to you. So now we're going to dive into the data a bit. So in Fact Sheet 1, this is where we show the overall poverty rate. So 20.3% of children in BC in 2016 were poor. That's 1 in 5, and that's, as you can see from the graph there, 172,550 children. It is higher than the red bar for Canada there, than the national average poverty rate. And in Canada, you can see it's 1.4 million children are poor, and we're not that far. One of the things we did see, and I'll show in another slide, is that we're closing the gap, but we are still higher than the Canadian average. So in 2016, about 1/3 of BC's poor children were under the age of 6. That's 55,160 children, young children. The under 6 poverty rate, as you can see there, was just over 20%, 20.1%. And this is the first year that we've seen the under 6 poverty rate below the overall 0 to 17 child poverty rate, or very close. And we're talking about a 0.2% difference. So they're pretty much almost equal. In previous years, the young children's poverty rate was higher by maybe as much as 5 percentage points in some cases. So this is a good trend. But we do know that the EDI, the Early Development Instrument, Wave 6 data that help gathers every few years, shows vulnerability going up, and the data there are not encouraging. So we're still with the last data set showing 32% of children were were vulnerable upon entry into kindergarten, and we know that poverty is a big factor in creating that vulnerability. So still something to watch always, to look at young children's poverty rate, and 1 in 5 is not a good number. So the fact that child poverty rates, as you can see from this chart as well, or this graph, are higher than the all ages poverty rate, which in BC is only 18.7%. I shouldn't say only, is 18.7%. Means, and it's the same for in Canada and all the provinces, the child poverty rate is higher than the all ages poverty rate. Just points to the need for systemic policy changes that better support families in their child rearing years. And we do know that in 2016, BC children made up 18% of the province's total population, and yet they made up 20% of British Columbians living in poverty. So again, we should be doing better by our children, for sure. People ask often how we compare to other provinces, because in the past, we were the worst for over a decade. We had the highest child poverty rate in the country. That is no longer the case. So as you can see from this graph, also in Fact Sheet 1, that child poverty is a Canada-wide problem. It's across all provinces and territories. Now we have data for territories. But at 20.3%, we were tied with PEI for basically the 7th highest child poverty rate out of Canada's 13 provinces and territories in 2016. This is similar to where we were in last year's report card, just some new numbers to it, and you can see that the highest is in Nunavut and Manitoba, and the lowest rates were in the province of Quebec and Yukon territories. So also in Fact Sheet 1, we look at underneath that 1 in 5 figure, which groups are overrepresented or have higher rates of poverty than the overall rate. And so here in these two charts, you can see some of that data. The first graph shows higher rates for new immigrant children, off-reserve Indigenous children, invisible or racialized minority children. And we know from other reports that we don't have data in this report card on, but that children affected by disabilities, whether they're the child or the parent, have higher poverty rates. And we don't have BC data on that at this point. We do know also, and we'll be looking at this shortly when we get to fact sheet 3, that children living in lone parent families have a much higher rate. But so these particular groups are overrepresented in the data given their representation in the population. And this year, as the bottom of this slide shows, a new graph, we have some data because, as you could see in the earlier graph, that's census data. It showed 31 basically % of Indigenous children off reserve were poor. And this year we have some data. It's only 45 BC First Nations reserves. And we want to first of all acknowledge that we know that reserves are not comparable or much smaller than traditional territories. So this is just a data source we get that, and so wanted to share it, but it's we just recognize that reserves don't reflect the larger traditional territories of BC's First Nations. But of the 45 reserves we had data available for this year, you can see that the overall poverty rate for, this is about 4,000 children, just under 4,000 children captured, with 44%. And when it's broken down into rural and urban reserves, you can see that the higher rate at 52% is there on rural reserves and 37% on urban reserves. So this is something we'd always had to say. As you can see in the earlier graph there, the failure of the census data to capture on-reserve poverty means it underestimates the poverty among Aboriginal children in BC. So now we're getting a little bit of a window into some of those unrecognized or uncounted children before. So I want to stop here just to see if there are any questions. I don't hear any. Nothing coming up yet. Okay, so I'll plow on here. So now we're into fact sheet 2. And this is where we look at BC's child poverty rates over time, because we're always interested, is it getting better or worse? So as you can see in this graph, we over the this is a 17-year period between 2000 and 2016, there is a slight decrease in the child poverty rate from the high of 27.6% in the year 2000 down to where we are now at 20.3%. So it's gone from basically over 1 in 4 to 1 in 5. This is a good trend. There has been a steady, it went up and down a bit, so there's been a steady decrease since 2010. And between last year, 2015, and 2016, the last 2 years we have data for, there were 12,420 fewer poor children, but it's still quite a high poverty rate. We're still at 1 in 5, and we're still higher than the Canadian average, as you can see from the red lines, higher than the gray line on the graph. But that gap is narrowing. You can see we've been much higher than the national rate over time, and it's much closer now. So again, that's a good trend for BC, but overall, stat is still too high. So very high. There's been some movement, very slow movement, especially considering that in many of those years there were budget surpluses in BC, where there was extra funds basically that could have gone towards some of the recommendations that we make in the report card. So the change over the last decade, so just the last 10 years, has only been just under 5 percentage points drop. And we want to hit 0, hopefully in our lifetimes, and before another generation of children grow up in poverty. So in the stress of poverty. So we want to accelerate this trend. There is another graph in the report card that I don't have a slide for here, showing the number of poor children in each of these 17 years. So if you're interested in those actual numbers, there's another chart there. And for those of you who want to compare the stats from last year's report card to this year's, you will notice that the 2016 and the historical rates going back to 2000 are higher due to the new, what's called a census family limb. You'll see at the top of the chart here, it says CF limb. That stands for Census Family Low Income Measure after tax. That's the data measure we use. And the historical rates, basically the whole chart has moved up about 2 to 3%. And that's because Stats Canada changed the way they calculate and capture children in families. We do think it's a more robust, a better measure, but it's just wanted to, so it didn't mean that poverty went up a whole bunch in the province because it was higher than last year by a few percent, it means that the way the data is collected has changed, and you can see the trend is still downward. I do want to pause a moment to discuss the measure that we're talking about, the LIM, the low income measure, and the data we use. So in the report card, there are two appendices, 1 and 2, where we discuss the low income measure used in the report. In 2018, in this year, several important changes occurred in the measurement of poverty in Canada. Statistics Canada updated its approach to how income rates are calculated in the low income measure, and that's the measure that we in Campaign 2000 have been using to report on child poverty for many years. This report card continues to use the low income measure, it's now called the CFLIM, as a measure of child and family poverty. The rates calculated through this new approach, as I've mentioned, are a bit higher than previous years. But we do think that it's a much more accurate picture and that the extent of child poverty was previously underestimated. So here's a look at, from the appendix, so sometimes people say, well, so what is the actual poverty line? It's not one, it depends on family size. So you can see from this chart in the appendix that if you're a family of, a single person, the poverty rate on this LIM is about $20,000 a year. A single parent with one child would be at just under $29,000, etc. So you can see the rates there if people ask you about that and you want to know, well, what is the poverty line? It's a series of lines. These are the poverty lines that are used or referenced throughout in this report, except when we're comparing minimum wages to poverty lines. Then we have to use a before tax measure because wages are before taxes are deducted. So except for the data, and also in that chart I showed you already with the overrepresented groups, it uses census data. Otherwise, all the data in the report comes from or is used using this measure. Then there's the issue, so this is a measure, but then there's the issue of what data do we apply against the measure. And we use the LIM after tax. It's a relative measure of poverty that sets the poverty threshold at 50% below the median census family income. So take the median of families with children across the country, 50% below that. So basically in the bottom quadrant or quarter of the income scale is where families are judged to be in poverty. The data source we use to do that is tax filer data, which provides a very reliable picture of low income in Canada because it captures the income situation of 96% of families with children. So we're very happy with that data set, and we like this inequality scale. But meanwhile, I just want to flag for you that the market basket measure has been adopted, which is another measure different than the LIM, and it's an absolute measure. It's been adopted by Canada as Canada's official poverty line. BC is also therefore going to adopt it in measuring the results of the new Poverty Reduction Strategy Act. So the MPM is an absolute measure of poverty. It's based on the cost of a basket of goods and services that our families require to meet their basic needs and maintain a modest standard of living. The federal government is reviewing what goes into the basket because that's the crucial thing. For instance, do you get a cell phone or not? That kind of thing. And you can participate in a public consultation about this on the web. If you're interested, contact us, or you can Google it. There is a consultation going on from the federal government right now. So there's a detailed discussion of these two measures and the data sources they rely on in Appendix 2 of the report. First Call and Campaign 2000 will have to revisit all of this, see if they revise the MBM in a way that we can use to see what data we collect for next year's report card. But we will always want to have some measure of inequality, so we may want to use both measures in the future. I just want to flag these in case you get questions about the data. So moving on, in Fact Sheet 3, so back to who's overrepresented. This is back to the data. Who's overrepresented in the child poverty stacks, so 1 in 5. Well, you can see children in lone parent families, it's 1 in 2, half. In fact, over half of all children living in single parent families or lone parent families in the province in 2016 were poor, which is 4 times the rate for children living in couple families. So they have a 2 in 1 chance of being poor. It's staggering, and it's as you can see over time, it's been even higher, and it just again points to the systemic ways that single parent families are not able to earn a decent living. There's many systemic barriers to that happening. We know we have a chart we don't show here, but there's another graph in the report card that shows that again on both of these, both lone parent family rates and couple family rates, we are higher than the national averages. We know that children in large families with 3 children or more, especially lone parent families, have a really high poverty rate of 61%. So a single parent with 3 or more children, almost 2/3 of them are poor. And we know this isn't published in the report card except for just one example, but we can pull this out if people are interested. The lone parent, the poverty rate for children in lone parent families does vary a bit, quite widely actually, between cities and towns. So, for instance, the lowest in the province of the data we have is in Victoria, where it's still quite high. It's 44% of children in lone parent families are poor in Victoria, but in Prince Rupert it's 62%. So that's an 18 percentage point difference, and quite a dramatic difference. So we can pull those data out. So, also here in fact sheet 3, you can see that we just want to point out that children in lone parent families only make up 1/5 of the child population, so they're about 19% of all children live in lone parent families, but they make up almost half of the poor children. So it's just another way to look at this data. So the number of children in lone parent families that are poor was 81,960 children, and the number of children in 2-parent families was 85,790. So one of the things we always say is children in all kinds of families are poor, but here's the breakdown in that some are more at a much higher risk of poverty than others. This year's data also shows about 4,800 poor children 0 to 17 who are not living in what the Stats Canada calls census families, and they had a 99% poverty rate. We don't know a lot about this group, but we know their definition is that they live either by themselves, or they live with unrelated people, or even sometimes with related relatives. So they might be in kinship care, or they might be living with just other people that are not related to them at all, family, other persons. So we don't know a lot about them. It's not a huge number. It's 4,800, but they have basically a very high poverty rate of almost 100%. I see. Just to let you know, if you want to ask questions, you need to press the orange arrow and then type in your question, and then we will moderate that. So sorry I didn't explain that at the beginning, but on this GoToMeeting thing. So yeah, just click on the orange arrow, and then you can type in a question. And Emily, my colleague, is monitoring that. So I will pause for a second for questions. Actually, I won't. I want to just finish with fact sheet 3 here. When we look at the rate of lone parent poverty, we just always like to highlight that it is quite a gendered issue. 82% of lone parent families are female-led, so we are talking a lot here. The majority is women's poverty, women and their children's poverty, and we give some numbers here about the median annual income of lone parent mothers being at 69% of the income of lone parent fathers. So there are some lone parent fathers also in poverty, but their median incomes are quite dramatically different. And so that children in female-led families are way overrepresented. And that, again, brings up those systemic issues like the unaffordability and unavailability of childcare, which would affect parents of either gender, but caregiving does often fall to women. Lower wages, more part-time work for women, they're more overrepresented in minimum wage work. All of those questions come to the fore. And as I've highlighted in this slide with the logo from the 10-a-day childcare plan, we're really pushing government on this to keep making those investments in starting to implement the 10-a-day plan, because it will have a huge impact on women's ability and families' ability to work and support their families. In fact sheet 4, we go into the depth of poverty, because sometimes people think, oh, well, it's, yes, we have poverty here, but it's not like it is in other countries, or those kinds of stereotypes, perhaps. Living at the poverty, in poverty here in BC is quite a challenge. Many poor families live very far below those poverty lines. So this is a graph that shows the poverty lines for different family types. And then what you can see is in the gray parts of the graph, you can see the average median income for those poor families. So lone parent with one child, their median income is just under $18,000 a year, etc. You can see that from the graph. And so you can see the gap between the median income of poor families of these different types and their poverty levels, and see that the poverty gap, the distance below the poverty line for all family types, ranged from around nearly $11,000 a year to over $13,000 a year. So families are living in very deep poverty, trying to live with one child on $18,000 a year is the average. And that means, since that's the median, that means many families are living on less than that. And so a lone parent with 2 children, their median income for those families, poor families here, is $23,500, but many are living on less than that. So it's just worth, because we know the impact of that for parenting, for access to food security, and we can get into some of that here. We have a little bit of data in the report card on the impacts of the depth of child poverty. So we have food bank statistics from 2016 showing that 33,000 of the food bank of children, BC children, relied on food banks in that year. And we know that some of the survey data shows that lone parent families, and particularly female-led lone parent families, have really high levels, more like food insecurity reported by the moms at around 24–25%, sometimes higher than they report for their children, and that represents the fact that they often go without or skip meals in order to make sure their children are fed. We know that 32% of food bank users were children in that year, and that it was going up between 2015 and 2016. And then when we look at homelessness, there was a youth homelessness count this year in Metro Vancouver, and 681 children and youth between 0 and 24 were counted in Metro Vancouver, and that included 291, or 42% of those children counted were under the age of 19. And we were found living in cars. So the report, if you want to check it out, reports whether they're housed or not housed, or living with in shelters, that kind of unsheltered. So, and some of the really disturbing statistics in profiling those homeless youth and children is that there's a much higher risk for LGBTQ2S, so gay and queer and two-spirit and transgender children have 26% of the homeless of the youth counted, much higher than their representation in the population. Indigenous children and youth represented 42% of those in the count, and a full 50% had experience in government care at some point in their lives. So, which again is why we spend a fair amount of time at First Call focusing on the Fostering Change campaign, trying to make sure that youth don't age out of care into homelessness because of these kinds of statistics. And back to families, we know that the consequences of that kind of stress of not having enough food, not having enough money for housing, let alone other what we might call extras that a lot of us take for granted, create huge stress on parents. It can affect your parenting, it can affect your health, parents' health as well as the health of their children. So again, the toxic stress of poverty can't be underestimated. Lots of research around that. When we get to fact sheet 5, you can see we start to talk about the poverty of children living with parents who work, and we always focus on this because they make up the vast majority of poor children live with parents who are in the workforce. Some of them have full-time, full-year work, and some of them work part-time or in precarious work or part-year and seasonal work, and would like to have full-time work. There's a variety of circumstances in that, but we know that they're not on income assistance. They're in working poor families. And so we always look at the minimum wage, because part of the advocacy we do is to push the minimum wage higher, because it's the floor for the lowest paid workers. In 2016, the minimum wage at that point was, for part of the year, or 2/3 of the year, was $10.45 an hour, and then it moved up to $10.85 an hour. But we aggregated that. So in the first part of this graph, if you look at the single parent with one child or the two-parent with family with 2 children, if they worked for the actual minimum wage over that year in 2016, there would be a poverty gap. They would be below the poverty line significantly for single parents, and not insignificantly at $3,000 below for a two-parent family with 2 children. Now in 2018, the government has raised the minimum wage to $12.65 an hour, and and they've accepted the recommendations of the Fair Wage Commission to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, but not until June 2021. And we have a recommendation in this report card that they accelerate the increases to reach $15 by the end of next year, 2019. Because as you can see in the graph, so the lighter blue bars there, working for $15 an hour minimum wage for even a single parent with one child would still leave them in poverty, but it would get them much closer. Our goal is always to get people over the poverty line, but lessening the depth of poverty is an important goal as well. For the two-parent family, that would actually take them above the poverty line if they both worked full-time at the $15 an hour minimum wage. So we know this makes a difference, and we need that floor to come up. But what you can see, certainly for the single parents, is that what we really need to get people over the poverty line is we need people to be paid living wages. So we do track that. First Call hosts the Living Wage for Families campaign, and we have so we calculate what a sample family of four with 2 young children need to earn, given all the tax credits or benefits, government benefits that are available. What do they need to earn? And then what are the actual expenses in different regions of the province? What do they need to earn in order to lift themselves over the poverty line? And we have a budget for them that would include them being able to access childcare, to some forms of transportation, to cover at least a modest rental apartment of 2 or 3 bedrooms, and their food costs, of course, as calculated by dietitians and stuff. So you can see in this report we have 6 regions outlined here: Vancouver, Abbotsford, Mission, Victoria, Parksville, it's actually Parksville, Qualicum, I think, and Kamloops, and not Price George, it's Prince George. And so you can see that what the living wage calculation is for those areas. It's, everywhere from $16.52 in Prince George up to, or $16.28 is the lowest in Abbotsford Mission up the Fraser Valley, to $20.64 an hour, that both parents would need to be working full-time and earning in order to hit the living wage budget. And we do know that, so what you're seeing in this graph is that a significant number, certainly in Vancouver, a third almost of couple families with children are not making the living wage, so living below, either somewhere near the poverty line or below it, perhaps. And in the others, you can see the percentages of families, couple families with children in those communities that are not earning a living wage. It's one of the metrics we can follow. We know that family incomes have not kept pace with family expenses rising, and I think probably everybody on the call could relate to that. That know that there's, rents have been going up, rental markets are very tight, food increase, cost of gas, cost of cell phones, everything has been going up, and so the cost of living and childcare has continually been going up. We're seeing some change in that with the investments from the government's fee reduction initiative, and hopefully that's starting to have an impact. Just want to mention that the Living Wage for Families campaign, the URL is there if you'd like to visit the website. We have certified about 130 living wage employers now in the province of BC, and you can get more information, or if you know of an employer, or if you work for an organization that wants to become a living wage employer, you can get more information by contacting us through that website. So in fact sheet 6, we look at families on income assistance, children on whose parents are on income assistance or disability assistance. And as I mentioned earlier, they're not the majority of poor children, but they certainly are some of the poorest, living in some of the deepest poverty. So you can see their welfare incomes, which would include both what they get in benefits and then what they get from like actual welfare benefits or disability benefits, and then the Canada Child Benefit and other tax credits and things like that. So this is a chart of their total welfare incomes for families, a lone parent family with one child and a couple with 2 children. There's only the number of children in 2016 that were on income assistance on average throughout the year was around 36,000 children. 85% of those were living with lone parents, and about 2/3 of them were not expected to work, so they were either on disability or temporarily or permanently unable to work due to disability or other reasons. So this is a group that we don't want to condemn to poverty forever and say, well, it's transient, they're just coming through. That's the case for some families, but many families cannot, the parents cannot work, and so their children are, this is their income. And for others, they may be moving off, and be able to move off, but they might get trapped here because this is such deep poverty that it makes it hard to get around to get to interviews, a whole range of issues there, not to get trapped on welfare because it's so low. We know that income assistance rates, social assistance rates, were not increased for over a decade between 2007 and 2017. They finally went up $100 a month in the fall of 2017. But that's a small increase, I would say. Families were happy to get that, but we're still calling for a substantial increase in the rates to bring them in line with actual living expenses and then index to them to inflation. So I hope that's so you can see the gap in that chart. If you have any questions, please type it in, and I think we break it out into federal and provincial contributions to welfare incomes just to show that BC's contribution over time. Well, it doesn't show over time here, but we track this, and we know that the federal contribution keeps getting bigger, and so we want BC to step up and be part of the solution there too, and make sure that welfare rates aren't too low. Also, so here's where we track in fact sheet 6 the welfare rates over time, because what's important to know is that they keep losing value when we don't raise them or index them to inflation. So these are inflation adjusted numbers. And what we can see is that they've been allowed to lose value over the last 28 years, despite the fact that cost of living has been going up. So 1994 is the peak. You can see around the time when the welfare incomes had their highest buying power. And in 2016, for instance, a lone parent family with one child was receiving about $1,300 or more less in inflation-adjusted dollars than the same family received in 1994. And a couple family with 2 children was a full over $2,000 more or more lower than in 1994. So they haven't made up the difference. And as I mentioned, families are frequently forced to rely on food banks and other sources of charity to both feed and clothe their children. So in the report card, I want to get to some maps now, just to highlight quickly. We have a lot of maps. Again, big thanks to Spark BC for helping us with this. So this is an example of one map that's in the print version, but it's kind of hard to see because the numbers are small. So if you go to the Still 1 in 5 website, you can see the maps and blow them up by just clicking on them. They report this particular map is regional districts around the province, the 29 regional districts. So you can look at, if you're calling in from somewhere else in the Lower Mainland, you can see that what the poverty rate is. Basically, the darker the area, the higher the poverty rate. There is considerable variation between the poverty rate for children in regional districts. The most severe is in the coastal regional districts. So they're in the Central Coast region, you can see that black area there, that Central Coast Regional District, 44.2% of children there are living in poverty. And then in sort of Mount Waddington, which is straddles the North Island and the coast, Skeena, Queen Charlotte, Alberni, Clayoquot Regional District, and Kitimat, Stikine, all were in the 31, 32, 33% rate. So 1 in 3 children there living in poverty. So those are the highest. And then you can see the lighter areas with the dots in them have the lowest rates. The Capital Region in Victoria and the East Kootenay Regional District were the 2 that had the lowest rates, but they still had over 16. They were both at 16.6% child poverty rate. So not anything to cheer about yet there. So, and you'll note the call out there on the map says 24 out of the 29 regional districts in BC had at least 1,000 children living in poverty. So there's another example of a map that you can see. This is not in the print version or on the web version, but when you go to the website, you can pull this up in the map section. So this is where we map all of the urban districts we have data for. There are 25 urban areas, and this is where actually 85% of the poor children in the province are in these urban areas. And you can see both the number of poor children in that urban area as well as the percentage of the child poverty rate. Children living outside these urban areas had a 25, 26% poverty rate, much higher than the provincial overall child poverty rate of 20.3%. Again, some high points or low points, depending on how you look at it. The Prince Rupert had the highest of the urban areas, the highest child poverty rate at 30.6%. Duncan was at 30%. Port Alberni at 29.8, or almost 30% there as well. The lowest rates were found in Squamish at just under 15%, and Victoria. So Victoria Regional District was 16.6. Victoria proper as an urban area was 16.1%, and Fort St. John was at 16.6. So those are the three lowest of the urban areas. Again, you can see those much better when you blow up the map on the website. So we hope this is useful to people around the province, communities around the province, to be able to pull out those specific statistics. And we can actually break some of these down also by lone parent families, couple families. We don't have all that information posted at this point, but are happy to respond to requests for data. Here's one more example of a graph on the website, because this is Metro Vancouver overall, where it's now, these are the areas that are color-coded here are census tracts, so much smaller areas. This is where 50% of the poor children in the province live, and that represents 86,480 children live in Metro Vancouver that are poor, who are poor. There are 15 additional maps on the website for individual Metro Vancouver municipalities. So, you know, Burnaby, Delta, Richmond, North Shore, Langley, these are all pulled out in separate maps on the website, and you're welcome to go look at those where it shows the census tracts. You know, one of the things we know is if you work in a community, you probably know where the poor neighborhoods are, but it's sometimes useful to have actual data to see the depth of poverty in those neighborhoods. We are coming soon are some additional graphs we haven't posted yet, but that ranks some of the urban areas or the cities by their child poverty rates and then by the number of poor children in those communities. In the text version and the web version, print version, and the web version of the report card, we give some additional detail on 7 cities: Victoria, Abbotsford Mission, Chilliwack, Kelowna, Kamloops, Nanaimo, and Prince George. So if you're in one of those areas and want to read up on those, you can see those. So we always want to go back to, and I mentioned when we were talking about measurement, that we report on inequality because we know it's the root cause of sustaining high rates of child poverty. So in Fact Sheet 8, we look at growing income inequality. Just want to, again, give people data to reference. So here we're looking at, in these infographics, the growth in income inequality between 1989 and 2016. Because it continues to grow not just in BC, but across Canada. The richest group of Canadians, they keep increasing their share of total national income, and the poorest and the middle income groups have been losing ground. And we care about this tremendously because the most robust international research around the social determinants of health shows that high rates of income inequality, not just absolute poverty, but actual inequality, especially in rich countries, negatively affects both rich and poor. It makes just a sicker society, I would say. Child well-being is much lower in more unequal countries. And if you're interested in that, we can send you a link to the Equality Trust website. There's some great data there that shows not just in Canada, but in other countries and different states in the U.S., how that inequality plays out in poor outcomes for children and social ills of various kinds. The first infographic on this slide shows the unequal shares of total income of BC families, with the richest 10% having the same income share as the poorest 50%, or the poorest half of families. So there's just one illustration of that. When we say total income, that refers to all income before taxes, including wages and salaries, self-employment earnings, earnings from investments. So it's all income that's reported on tax returns. It also includes government benefits from federal and provincial governments, such as child tax benefits or GST credits, and employment insurance, and that kind of thing. The second part of the graph here, the second graphic, shows the richest 10% of families who saw their incomes grow much faster, at 37.9 or 38% growth between 1989, over those 28 years, between 89 and 2016. So on average, that top decile of families gained 70,000 or almost 71,000 in annual income. And the rate of growth for the poorest 10% was only 9.4%, and their annual dollar increase over that time was just $1,900. So that's where you can again see that the trend continues and the inequality continues to grow. There is a short chart within the actual report card that shows the actual income deciles. It's in fact sheet 8, shows each, decile 1, decile 2, decile 3, all the way up. So if you want to see each figure for each year, what it was in inflation adjusted dollars for 1989 and what it is now, or in 2016. And you'll see there that the top 5 deciles, or the richest half, collect nearly 3/4 of all income received by BC families, leaving only 1/4 for the other half. So that's the income inequality we don't want to forget is happening. It's not normal. It doesn't have to be that way. Then in fact sheet 9, we look at the importance of government help, because we don't just put out a bunch of stats and say we can't do anything about this. We know that government help makes a big difference, and we want to illustrate that in the report card. So we get stats. We do a custom run from Stats Canada, and we get some data on what the poverty rate, it's called by Stats Canada the market poverty rate, what the poverty rate, child poverty rate would be before what are called government transfers. And there's an explanation of what those are in the report card. So that would be things like the Canada Child Benefit or GST credits and that kind of thing. So before those kinds of measures are received by families, what's their market poverty rate? And the market poverty rate in British Columbia would have been 29% without those government transfers. So in 2016, it would have been 29%. It came down to 20.3% after those government transfers. So that's a reduction of 29%. And it means that 71,560 children were lifted out of poverty thanks to government transfers. So we know things that work. We just need to do more of them. I'm sure there's new things we can do, and we have suggestions around that as well. But of some of the things we're doing, like direct child benefits, we know they actually make a difference, and we need to double down on a number of them. Here's a graph that also in fact sheet 9 that shows that percentage that BC lowered after government transfer payments were responsible for 29% drop in child poverty rates, and you can see where we rank with other provinces and with Canada. So our rate of reduction in child poverty was below the Canadian average of 38%, and you can see that provinces like Quebec do have a 47% drop. So there's something they do more, and we know what some of that is. And I'm going to just reference some of that in the next slide. So one of the recommendations we're making this year is to increase the BC's early childhood tax benefit, make it just a child benefit, make it go from 0 to the 18th birthday, as you can see in the chart other provinces do with their provincial benefits, instead of having it end at the child's 6th birthday, and to increase the amount. So this is one of those direct income transfer tax government transfers we've just been talking about that would make a big difference. Right now it's only $660 a year overall, and which means that if a family if a family qualifies for the maximum benefit of $55 a month up to their child's 6th birthday, the total investment that BC makes in that income support is less than $4,000, whereas in other provinces you can see that, again, if the family or that particular family stays within the threshold when they receive this benefit, in other words, in the lower income threshold, they would get a much bigger lifetime investment in their children. And some are indexed, ours is not. So we've been pushing really hard. We've given a research report to government, had a number of conversations with them, and hoping that in the next budget we'll see some movement on this recommendation. And then coupled with the national benefit, we hope that would really start to move the numbers in future report cards. We should start seeing a real decrease in the child poverty rate. So we get to recommendations. Big part of the report card we spend. These are the suggestions we put forward to government, recommendations to government. So I want to just start by acknowledging that Bill 39 was passed unanimously in the House on November 5th. So we have the Poverty Reduction Strategy Act in law. We've been asking for BC to have a legislated plan with targets and timelines, and they've the government's responded. They've legislated a target to reduce BC's child poverty rate by 50% within 5 years, starting with January of next year. We're very happy about that target and about that. Though, I mean, I think here at First Call, we've been calling for this kind of a reduction for many years. We'd like it to have happened years ago, but given we're in the moment, let's just say, okay, government's made this commitment. We'd like to see this target exceeded, and we think if they acted on many of our recommendations, we might be able to exceed, get below a bigger than 50% reduction within 5 years. Just in the slide, we note that we want to recognize that children, some of the overrepresented groups we highlighted in earlier parts of the report, who are at greater risk of living in poverty, that any efforts to reach that target must also reach into those groups, and we should see their poverty rates come down by 50% as well, not just those who are very close to the poverty line already, or in other words, it can't just help those who are already almost out of poverty. It must reach some of those in deeper poverty and those in these overrepresented groups. I should also note that the federal government has introduced a Poverty Reduction Act as well. It hasn't passed yet. They have put out a poverty reduction strategy or a plan. So there is movement at both senior levels of government. And so our job now as an advocacy coalition, and I hope all of you on the call and others in the province see our job is to support both levels of government to make sure their commitments that they've made are translated into ambitious and fully funded actions that ensure poverty reduction targets are met or preferably exceeded, especially for children. So now I'm just going to walk quickly through the 20 recommendations and how are we doing for time. I'm going to rush through these pretty quickly because we've referenced a lot of them. The first is minimum wage coming up. You can read that one in the report card. Some of these they're longer when you read the actual report card, but these are the summary. So there's 20 recommendations in here, and you can support all or some of these by writing to your MLA and to the Premier. There's a letter on the website. So of course we want the minimum wage to go up. I've mentioned living wages. We want the governments are large employers and they contract out lots of work too. So we want to make sure living wages are part of their policy when they're spending government money on our behalf. We want to, I've mentioned the low rates of income assistance and welfare rates, so we need to get those up and index them. Mention the childhood tax benefit going up, and we want to ensure that the Canada Child Benefit, along with other income measures, which would include provincial benefits, etc., that we hit some targets raising all children above the poverty line, ensure access to the benefits. There are a number of groups who pay taxes but don't have trouble getting the Canada Child Benefit, so there's a bunch of work to be done around that. Recommendation 6, this is where we look at maternity leave and parental leave, which are currently delivered through the employment insurance system, which is incredibly unsatisfactory because it's not available to all new parents. The benefit levels are too low for many low income or low earning families to take advantage of the 52 weeks. They can't afford to live on the benefits, so they have to go back earlier. So we'd like to see a revamp of the Canada's maternity and parental leave benefits so that they're universally available to all new parents and that the benefit levels are not below poverty lines. Also to enhance employment insurance so that those who are out of work temporarily also don't fall below the poverty line. So we want that program's been whittled away over time, so we have some recommendations around making sure that that benefits actually support families from falling deep into poverty in between jobs. We want access in number 8 here. We want to address a growing income inequality by continuing efforts to increase fairness in the income tax system, so that's where we focus there. And then we have another group of recommendations. So all those earlier ones were about income supports and tax fairness. And now we want to look at the recommendations to make that are to those targeted initiatives for groups who are overrepresented. So number 9 is carefully, or kind of not worded fully here, but collaborate with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit governments and Indigenous organizations to develop robust plans to eradicate poverty among Indigenous families. And that has to be led by First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities themselves. Expand post-secondary program options eligible for support under the Single Parent Employment Initiative. So this is for families on income assistance. There is a program called the SPEI that allows parents to go to work, but they're only allowed to take programs that are 12 months or shorter, and we think that everybody on income assistance should be allowed to attend post-secondary at this point until post-secondary is free, or there are much more robust supports for that. So it's one of the ways, it's a path out of poverty for many people, that they're stuck not being able to access more training or education. We also I mentioned youth aging out of care. They should be able to count on universal and comprehensive social safety net dedicated to their specific needs. And through our Fostering Change campaign, we're working very hard on that and supporting youth to do that advocacy themselves. We want to enhance supports to kinship care providers. That would be grandparents raising grandchildren and other kinship care providers, and allow those, when they turn 65, let them keep the children's benefit, the CPP children's benefit, because they are raising children still. There's a number of barriers for kinship providers to receive the Canada Child Benefit, so working with Elizabeth Fry Society, one of our member organizations, and others to try and remedy that for some of the most vulnerable families. We want to see intensification of efforts to help immigrants and refugees with enhanced employment assistance, language training, so and improving their employment standards, protections, and enforcement. So a number of issues there, recognition of their credentials, that kind of thing, to make sure, because they're so overrepresented in the poverty data. We want to see immediate cancellation of all refugee transportation loan debt. That's still an embarrassment for Canada that we make refugees pay back. We gave some of the Syrian refugees had their loans canceled, but that it wasn't made universal. It's kind of a dog's breakfast of what they've done there, but they're still making refugees pay loans back, and we think that's quite shameful and unacceptable. The last group of recommendations is aimed at lowering barriers and improving lives through universal programs. So here's where we push for that $10 a day childcare plan, for K-12 public education funding to be sufficient to mitigate inequalities and make sure that children or students with diverse learning needs have their needs met within schools. We want to see that post-secondary education for low-income students barriers removed, and that would mean lowering student debt levels across the board. Ultimately, we'd like to see free post-secondary education, as they have in many countries, but in the meantime, we'd like to see policy options like reduced tuition fees, more grants instead of loans, and make sure that student loans are interest-free, so they don't just build up for families, especially at the time when they're starting to have and raise children. We'd like to see housing, huge issue, put in few words here, but basically federal and provincial funding scaled up to build thousands of new social housing and affordable rental housing units, maintaining existing affordable housing stock like co-ops and existing rentals, and reduce, the number of families in core housing need to eliminate homelessness. 19, introduce universal coverage. This is part of what's missing out of the healthcare system, that a lot of low-income families can't afford prescription drugs that when they are prescribed, dental care, vision care, hearing aids. These are essential aspects of healthcare, and we want to see that as part of a universal healthcare for all Canadians. And lastly, providing free public transit where it exists for minors, and free or reduced fee transit access for low-income families. Again, this comes up from families all the time about they can't afford bus passes here in the Metro Vancouver area, and they can't afford to get to doctor's appointments. Kids can't afford to get to school. They can't afford to get to job interviews, all those kinds of things. So again, that shouldn't be a barrier, and there should be a way to we have lots of recommendations on how to make that happen. And that's the end of the recommendation. So here's our contact information, our Facebook and Twitter handles and tags, and our addresses, our website addresses, and our email addresses. And I'm gonna we're very late, but I want to open it up, and I don't know if there's been any questions. Emily's shaking her head. There haven't been any questions, and I know we've kind of run out of time here, but I want to invite you, if you have any questions as you look at the data, or go to the website and look at if there's something you don't understand or some data you'd like to dig down into a bit more, please don't hesitate to call us here at First Call, or contact us by email, and send in your queries. I hope you find this report card useful in your advocacy, and we welcome your suggestions on how we can help make it a more useful tool for you in the future. There will be a short form of the report card also being published shortly. Thank you very much for your participation today, and happy advocating.